The question that we're asking here is, what is a man, what is a woman? And I am not happy with even the conservative answer, which is a woman is a womb and 2X chromosomes. I don't know what 2X chromosomes are. If you told me that a woman is sugar, spice, and everything nice, that to me is a much more precise description and accurate description. Because regardless of whether or not one wishes for the law to regulate transgenderism, it will. Even the most tolerant, open-minded, pluralistic society cannot simultaneously uphold mutually contradictory principles. In even the most liberal society, the law must answer at least certain basic questions. If the law has nothing to say about what a woman is, then the law has nothing to say at all. My opponent might suggest we leave it to private business to decide, but the practical implications of transgenderism extend far beyond private business, to the military, to public schools, to government employees, and to many other sectors of society. The law cannot evade the question. The bathroom issue keeps coming up because it is so clear and so instructive. It presents a conflict between two supposed rights: the right of women to have their own bathrooms, and the supposed right of some men to go into the women's bathroom, thereby abolishing women's bathrooms. The law must pick a side. There is no neutrality. Unlike some other political issues, there can be no middle ground. Either women get their own bathrooms or they don't. Either women have rights and legal protections as women, as they always have, or they don't. The law might say they do, and the law might say they don't. But the one thing the law cannot say is nothing. I think that what's very important here is prudence. This is one of those forgotten virtues that people in our highly ideological age think that we need to have a manifesto written in 5 bullet points on a napkin to answer every question. But for example, if someone is a man who has fallen into the transgender rabbit hole, and for him it is, as it historically has been for pretty much everybody, a sexual fetish, a paraphilia of cross-dressing that is largely driven by pornography today. But that man still understands that he's a man. This is just a little weird thing that he does at home, and it makes him have a thrill, and okay, fine, we live in a fallen world. I wouldn't suggest we need to commit that man. But there is a spectrum here of irrationality and insanity, let's call it what it is. And so if a man is convinced that he really is a woman, like in some of those viral videos we've all seen of the big burly man screaming in the bodega, "My name is ma'am, my name is ma'am," and he's acting out in a way that is really disorderly and disrupting the public and harmful to himself. For instance, if he wants to chop off his own healthy body parts and cause all sorts of destruction to himself, then I think not only is it the right of society to take some action here to restore order, but I think it's only compassionate for that person. I think it's a very selfish and shallow kind of liberalism that says that when people have mental problems, we ought to just let them out on the street, often to die of exposure or to go do drugs in some back alley in San Francisco. No, we owe them help. Brad asks, who am I to tell people what to do? Why would I use the force of government? We live in America. America is at least supposed to be a self-government. You're a citizen with faculties of reason and a moral conscience. You can perceive truth, and it is not only your right, but your responsibility to do so, to help your fellow countrymen. I consider myself very, very open-minded, as we all are in America, but on certain issues we cannot be totally open-minded. Because on some issues you see a conflict of rights and a conflict of claimed rights and a conflict of freedom. So if we were debating tax policy, we might come to some conciliatory middle ground and we might hear all sides. If we were discussing immigration, we might say, okay, we take in 3 million immigrants a year today. Conservatives don't want to take in any more immigrants. We've taken in a lot, but okay, let's meet in the middle somewhere. On this issue, we can't do that because either the women have the bathrooms or they don't. Either the women have the sports teams or they don't. Certain issues, you can't just meet in the middle. On certain issues, you would split the baby, which is no good for anybody. So here, Brad is claiming the freedom of the transgender identifying people, men who think that they're women mistakenly, to enter into the women's bathroom. And what I'm defending is the genuine freedom and right of women to have their own bathrooms. Only one of those is going to win out. Only one of those is in accordance with reality, so I would just as soon defend the one that happens to align with the truth.
Why is this the issue where you want to bring the force of law, the force of your voice, to contest this disagreement among the many you have with your neighbors?
Well, because this one would appear to be exclusive. This one is inescapable. I can escape from the Episcopalian church down the street, and I don't attend it. I can escape from many liberal Catholic churches down the street, by the way, for that matter, and there's no problem. Nobody's forcing me to attend. But on the question here, women will have bathrooms or they won't. Women will have sports teams or they won't. And I will engage in conversation with people because we live in a society. We're not atomized individuals, and no man is an island entire of himself. So when I am to refer to somebody, especially as a matter of public life, if I am not permitted to refer to him as him and her as her, I am being forced to lie in my regular everyday life. Contrary to what Brad suggested, I am not a totalitarian, I'm not an authoritarian, I'm not against pluralism or whatever, but there are certain issues on which one side has to win and one side has to lose because they can't exist together at the same time. So Brad points out that Blair, who's a very nice guy, as I pointed out, might feel better by being allowed to go into a women's bathroom. I'm skeptical of that. None of the data, which I always think are ridiculous, but I'm happy to cite social science when it backs up my point. But all of the data that we have suggests that there is no mental health benefit whatsoever from these sorts of surgeries and from the hormone therapies. So I'm skeptical that it would make them feel any better. But then I have to ask, what about the women? What about the women who would very much like to have their own bathrooms? Wouldn't that make them happy? Don't they have some rights? Now, a lot of what Brad just said is not true. Brad said that America is very liberal and open-minded on these transgender issues. It doesn't seem to be the case. According to Pew Research, 60% of Americans say that manhood and womanhood is determined by biological sex. And so I wish it were 100%, but 60% is not bad. It's a clear majority of the country. It's up from 56% just a couple of years ago, and it's up from 54% in 2017. So the American people are on our side on transgender issues because they have eyes and a brain, and the American people are increasingly on our side on these issues. As for the freedom of these people to mutilate themselves and to harm themselves, I wonder if Brad would extend that same conception of freedom to someone who suffers from a body integrity disorder. Body integrity disorder is very similar to transgenderism in that it involves people, usually early onset, about 8 to 12 years old, who will imagine that a healthy limb does not really belong to them, and they'll ask a doctor to cut off that healthy limb. This would be medical malpractice today. I don't think any of us would want to allow some poor soul to have their limbs chopped off because of a disorder. We would want to give them psychiatric treatment. So I don't really see why the same principle wouldn't hold true here, especially considering the very harmful effects of the transition. Well, I'm not saying that the government is the arbiter of truth, of course not, but we have civil authority to establish and to enforce laws. And so we can either establish and enforce laws on the basis of pure will, you know, a man who says, I very much want to be a woman, and so that's what we're going to do, completely divorced from reality and the moral order, or we can establish and enforce laws as a matter of interpretation, to believe that there is such a thing as objective reality and a moral order and a natural law that we are then translating into the civil law. Traditionally, in our country and in all states, we have pursued the latter. In our age that now seems to be increasingly untethered from reality, where people will mock the very notion of objective truth, we say that that cannot happen. But to my points earlier, the law will say something, inevitably. The government is not some foreign entity. We live in America, where we have some say in our government, even still today, and the law must necessarily say something. Either the women get, the reason I keep going to the bathrooms is because it's just so clear, but you can use the sports teams, you can use, I would most like to see this issue studied not through biology and not through some bizarre sociology course in a gender studies department, but through anthropology and through ontology and through philosophy. Because ultimately what this comes down to, I'm happy that all the scientific studies back up my view, but I wouldn't really care even if they didn't. Because the question is, what is the human person? The claim of transgenderism, it keeps moving, but the claim basically is that one's true self has nothing to do with one's body. So one can be in body entirely a man, but at some deeper metaphysical level, one can be a woman. And so the old way we used to talk about this would be the distinction between the body and the soul. And there's been a whole lot written about the relationship between the body and the soul. The conception that has dominated for at least 2,300 years in our civilization is an idea called hylomorphism, which is that body and soul are united, and sex derives from the body and is an inseparable accident of the individual that persists and applies to the whole person. So that's, to me, a fascinating conversation. I don't think that one's view has to be arbitrary on this matter. I don't think my view is arbitrary. I just don't think transgenderism transgenderism is true.
Well, we were talking about age. We were talking about
well,
age.
but this gets to age because for all of human history, pretty much no one has thought that the transgender idea really is true, and you don't seem to think that it really is true. It's interesting.
Well, I think I view it I have a different definition of it.
But here's the inconsistency that I find in your point. You say that when you turn 18, you ought to be able to chop yourself up and put on a dress and go into a women's bathroom, and putting aside the public issues that come from that, I just wonder how it is the case that transgenderism is false for the first 18 years and then suddenly becomes true when one turns 18. And if that is not what's really happening, if it is false and your trepidation in exposing children to this is because it obviously is false, if it's false and harmful for children, why is it beneficial and true for adults? Shouldn't we apply an even standard across the board?
Yeah.
I think this point by the phantom of Professor McCloskey is a very good one, because it would seem to me that what transgenderism is proposing is an anthropology. It's an idea about what human nature is. And so if it is true, then it is true for children, and I'm not using this to suggest we get rid of transing the kids. Ultimately, I think that, of course, but if it's true, then it would seem to me very cruel to prevent a child from transitioning, especially before puberty. Because if you can suppress a child's puberty, and then you can put them on cross-sex hormones, and then you can have the little boy look more like a little girl, he is going to much more successfully pass as the opposite sex than if he were to be put on these kinds of hormones and have these procedures much later. It would be much more expensive, it would be much more painful. And so if transgenderism is true, then I think we have to trans the kids. Now, it so happens that transgenderism is not true, and there are people who are in all various states of anxiety and depression and suicidality even, who have fallen into this confusion of transgenderism later on. And so just as I think it would be wrong to lead children who are behaving in an irrational way down this path, I think it would be quite wrong to do that to adults as well. Mr. Polumbo has conceded the point that at the extremes of anorexia, it would be fine to force feed somebody or force somebody into hospitalization. Mr. Polumbo has made the point that someone suffering body identity disorder would not be able to get this sort of a surgery to remove a limb. What doctor in his right mind would do it? I will point out there are doctors today removing the healthy breasts of 14-year-old girls, so I think you can find a lot of quacks out there. In fact, there have been quacks who have performed this surgery, but none of us, I think, believes that we ought to chop off the healthy limbs of these very mentally ill people. So I just don't see why we wouldn't apply that down the line. Professor McCloskey's position is a consistent position, and it's consistently wrong. And I think that if we're going to be right here, we have to be consistently right. This is such an important point. And the reason that you've seen this kind of radical polarization where now we go topsy-turvy every election that we're able to win, for that matter. Sometimes the Democrats rule for a long time. The reason for that is because we no longer have shared norms and standards. And so the very thing that I am arguing is a solution to this problem. The reason that our norms and standards have broken down is because half a century ago, leftist activists decided to upend our standards and norms in our culture, to say that having any standards or norms at all would be authoritarian and anti-American. And so what happened was the left pushed their radical new standards. In the 1950s, the 1940s, you could read the Bible in schools, you could not read pornography in schools. Today, you cannot read the Bible in schools, you can, and in some cases are assigned to read pornography in schools. It's not a battle of more freedom or less freedom, it's a battle of what standards are we going to have, what taboos are we going to have. And so what happened, especially in the 60s, is the left knocked down all of the old standards. They insisted upon their standards in their place, and the conservatives lost the ability to even speak about standards, to even speak about the good, the true, and the beautiful, the common good, what's true and false. And as a result, the left has totally upended things. But I think if we can reassert a sensible vision, then things will go less topsy-turvy. I've said it before, I suppose I'll say it again. In the United States, we are the government. Even with all the corruption, we are the government. And if we surrender our capacity for reason and moral conscience, if we really say that we can't know the difference between true and false and right and wrong, then we're surrendering self-government. This is what John Adams meant when he said the Constitution's built for a moral and religious people. That wasn't soft soap and a nice platitude. He's saying that's how self-government works. If we surrender that, we lose the American project.